What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Introduction to Comparative Politics. I hope that you're doing well and having a good morning. I'm very happy that you're here with me today. I'm happy to be here too. We are going to continue talking about research methods and specifically the methods that we use in comparative politics to answer questions about similarities and differences that we observe across countries. And this conversation is going to build on the discussion that we had on Tuesday about science and the scientific method as an approach to generating knowledge among other competing approaches. And we're going to build on that discussion by specifically addressing questions about how comparison itself is scientific and the way in which comparison helps us to do the kinds of things that we're interested in doing in a scientific analysis. And our starting point today is this interesting sort of question or idea. You hear this all the time. Apples and oranges are truly unfit for comparison. They're so fundamentally different that they can't really be compared to one another or looked at alongside one another. This is a common phrase that you hear all the time. But what's interesting is that the phrase doesn't actually make a lot of sense from the point of view of comparative methods and the methods that we use in this class and in comparative politics, because it's actually the case that one approach we use involves comparing fundamentally different cases to figure out why they're similar in some key regard. And so the idea that very different things cannot be compared actually doesn't hold water when we really begin to use the methods themselves. And so as we get started, I want you to keep an open mind and be open to the various ways that we can use these methods to compare similar and different cases. And so from our perspective, as we get started, we can actually compare apples and oranges, sort of metaphorically speaking. We have methods for doing this and for comparing radically different cases or situations. And I'm going to show you step by step how those methods work as we go along. But before we get started today, I want to kind of get us thinking critically and deeply about the process of comparison and about science as a method, as a set of approaches or a set of steps involved in trying to generate knowledge. And I want to put a question to you all, and I'll hope that you'll consider the reading, but also our discussion on Tuesday. And my question is, how is the process of comparison scientific? How is comparison itself scientific or similar to the scientific method? Or in what ways does the scientific method itself rely on comparison? You might also choose to answer the question, how does the comparison of countries help us to understand the larger political world? So what do we learn about politics through the comparison of countries that we could not learn without comparing countries? And I'd like us to step back and pause for a moment. And I'd like to hear from you. And I want to incorporate as much input as we possibly can. So let's pause and take a few minutes and think about this. And I'll monitor the chat and wait for your replies. So Brady says the process of comparing can be scientific even if we are comparing two very different things. So for example, the comparison of species. Yeah, Brady's right. It is true that we can pick out specific dimensions for comparison or specific characteristics of things that might be very, very particular and very specific, but are of interest to us. And so the way we compare countries is often very similar. We look at specific issue areas, and those radically different cases can often be quite comparable, either because of their differences or because of their similarities in certain areas or issue areas. And so it is true that we focus on specific kinds of questions, and we're not always looking at the broad, huge picture. That's important to keep in mind, because when you answer a research question, that question is always going to be very specific and have to do with a very specific in narrow issue area, virtually always, because of the way that we do this. Ian says comparison allows for different results to be viewed so that those conducting the comparison can reveal what caused these different outcomes. Without comparison, data is left at its source and cannot be checked for confounding variables. Yeah, so Ian's pointing out that when we compare things, there are differences and similarities that emerge across those things and those cases that we're comparing. And it's that process of comparison that allows us to see where they diverge and where they are similar. And then we can rule out a role or a causal role for some variables based upon what sets of causes and effects go together in the data, as far as we can tell. You can't do that if you examine a single case or a single observation, because you don't have variation on the key variables. Alexis says, you can use comparison as a means of verifying if your hypothesis or a theory is correct or applicable in most cases. That's exactly right, Alexis. We use comparison to test hypotheses because we can isolate on varying variables and variation in those key variables that we think might be causes and effects in those cases. And if we only have a single case, we can't do that. And so we're really stuck. And so we have to look outside of our comfort zone and compare countries or compare time periods. Nina says, science is the accumulation of knowledge about the world through systematic practices that uses evidence in the testing of hypotheses. Comparison in that sense is used as a way to test out a hypothesis to see whether it is true or not. Yeah, so comparison is useful in this way because we can test hypotheses. The data from those multiple countries becomes useful to see if those hypotheses are correct and if the causes that we anticipated really are doing the work in the real world when we look at the data. Stephen says the process of comparison is scientific because we start with a question and form theories that we then have to test and then find information based on those hopefully unbiased questions and theories. Yeah, Stephen, in those theories that we develop, those theories involve variables, right? Factors that take multiple values in different cases. And so testing those theories and those hypotheses requires finding cases that match the values, the different values on the variables in our theory. And so we do need to compare multiple cases that have different values on those key variables. And that's that process of analysis and causal inference that does allow us to establish a basis for our theories and our hypotheses. And so I'm so happy to see that over and over, we're noticing that hypothesis testing requires comparison. This is really important to know because this is how we begin to do politics scientifically in comparative politics. So Valentin says the process of comparison is scientific by seeking the relationship between two or more variables. That's exactly right. And it's the variation in those variables and the different values that different cases take that produces those patterns of similarity and difference that we can then exploit and analyze to try to see if those theories and hypotheses that we have are working out. You're going into depth on how things have certain similarities. Yes, we'll take a look at some data here later in the lecture, and we'll examine the data using different methods of comparison. And we'll see both similarities and differences. And so right now we're beginning in a kind of abstract way where we're addressing the question of how comparison is scientific or how the scientific process itself involves comparison. Because as you'll see, we're kind of slowly connecting science to comparative politics. And I want you to see in a fluid way how they do connect to each other in kind of a philosophical sense as a set of approaches to knowledge generation. Anna Martha says, comparing countries is susceptible to statistical analysis, but not always is the case. Yeah, Anna Martha, so what we'll see and what you've seen in the reading already is that we often generate our hypotheses in comparative case study analyses with a small set of cases, but we also test those hypotheses in larger data sets where we examine a huge number of cases and we try to find out if our causes are producing the effects that we anticipate. And so what I want to encourage you to do is think about how case study approaches and quantitative approaches might work together and complement each other as two approaches to testing hypotheses about causes and effects. In this course, we're going to focus a lot on testing hypotheses and forming hypotheses in case studies and through comparative case studies. But this is just one course that you're taking, and you're going to learn about other methods and other approaches that are equally valid and that hopefully you'll see do complement one another. Efren says, the comparison of countries helps us to understand the motive of why those nations behave in a certain manner. If we only make inferences on countries such as the United States, New Zealand, or Australia, then data will indicate that others interact the same manner. Good, good. So what's interesting about comparative politics is that although we generate our hypotheses often in a smaller set of cases, the sort of ability of those hypotheses to travel is always limited unless we test them in larger data sets. And so comparative politics means not just comparing a small set of cases, but also eventually examining a large set of cases to see if those patterns of similarity and differences hold across that bigger data set. And so the similarities and the differences that we really care a great deal about, they matter equally as much in both the case study and the quantitative approaches. And so the reading talks about that, and we will emphasize that in this class as well, although our work and our assignments in this course will primarily use the comparative method as a set of case study methods. David says, the process of comparison allows the scientific to proceed furthermore in order to find the correct trial. Yeah, so it's through comparison that we can rule out certain variables and identify the limits to certain variables or certain expectations that we had about what causes should really be found in the data. Jake says, comparison of countries helps us understand the larger political world because we can see what kind of systems or solutions work and which don't. We can learn from others around the world instead of trying to do everything ourselves. Good, Jake. And one example is the similarity between Latin American countries and the United States in terms of our political systems. We can actually learn a great deal from what happens in Latin America because our systems are so similar. And specifically, we have presidential systems that have a balance of power between different institutions of government and independently elected presidents and legislatures. And so that's just one example, but you're exactly right. We can observe patterns in a larger set of cases and across regions and across different and similar countries to figure out stuff about, well, how might our politics work under certain circumstances, or what is possible here that maybe has happened elsewhere in similar circumstances. So that's very good. And we do have these ethical and moral considerations as well. If we often choose our questions in the first place because of some ethical commitment, we decide that what is just or what is good should influence or inform the questions we ask. And so if we're learning from other countries, we're often looking at their experience to try to figure out, well, what did they go through and how could we either avoid that or improve on that? And so these are moral and ethical questions as much as they are analytical questions. And so as we continue, what you'll see is that we do separate the two. We believe that it's okay for our questions to be informed by those considerations as long as our analysis itself is objective and is systematic. And the scientific method hopefully helps us to filter out any biases that we might have that might influence how we view the data or interpret the data. So this is all very good. And these elements of the discussion all play into the research design and the question that we ask and the comparisons that we make. Rady says, second question, by looking at two different countries with different political systems, we get a more broad result that can be used to analyze other countries that may have similarities to one or other countries previously analyzed. So basically, it's a good thing because we already have a base to start working on it. Yeah, exactly. And I've got something I'll share with you in a moment that kind of reiterates that point, Rady, about how we need sort of like a standard, right? Like this kind of external standard that we use to compare or assess or evaluate new cases against so that we can get a sense of where those cases stand and have a very rigorous and robust kind of basis for drawing inferences based on those relative differences. And this is such an essential point, and it's very abstract, but the general idea that we need that external standard holds up because it's only through the establishment of some standard that we can begin to actually draw conclusions. And this is so essential, and I'm so glad that you made the point. Kevin says the only key between this and STEM sciences is that this seems to be predominantly retrospective studies. Yeah, that's right, Kevin. It's difficult for us to make predictions, and historically, crises, financial, political, etc., have been virtually impossible to predict. But it's much easier for us to look back in time and learn from what has happened and try to understand it systematically so that we can make decisions now that we think might prevent something from happening again that would be undesirable. So that's a very good point. And I think that one difference that comes out of that point that you make is the fact that there's the possibility of exerting more control over the study in STEM. You know, you have a little bit more control over the variables you're in the lab. We can't rerun an election here in political science. You know, we can't carry out or undertake processes that are experimental. We can run experiments in the lab without a doubt, but a lot of the questions in comparative politics that we're interested in are really difficult to duplicate in that setting. And so that's what partly explains why we're often learning, you know, in hindsight. We're looking at what happened in history and using that as our laboratory, because it's very difficult for us to generate a setting that's controlled and that we can sufficiently control in the same way that you can in STEM. Nina says, to answer number 2, we understand the larger political world through the help of comparison, mostly because we are being exposed to more than one way a country runs politically. And this exposure through comparison gives us a better understanding of how many different ways politics is approached. Absolutely. And we learn about the different ways that politics is conducted in different places and how those differences can arise out of all sorts of institutional or political or social or economic or geographical or cultural or historical differences that might precipitate that outcome or that variation that we're interested in. And so we learn a lot about these countries and what they've gone through and their history and their experience. And that's what I like about comparative politics a lot. We do dignify individual cases and study them in all of their detail, but we also examine them together comparatively to try to learn from them together. And that's a nice mix of the sort of holistic on the case level and the more analytical on the sort of comparative level. And that's one thing that I've always liked about comparative politics. And I still do, and I think I always will. Christiana says, comparison between multiple variables can help you see similarities and differences between 2 or more subject groups. Yeah, and then those similarities and differences can then become part of our causal inferences that we draw about what might explain the variation between the 2 sets. And so this is one of the most important components of what we do. We make these descriptive inferences so that we can then draw causal inferences about the potential relationship between variables based on the patterns that we observe and the data across those cases that we can only see when we have multiple cases. Kevin says, retrospective studies allows us to see the outcomes of the past, and by observing the past and the circumstances of that past in order to understand the past, present, and future political worlds. Right, we try to predict what will happen based on what we can see back in the past when we turn around and take a look at our history. And though history is often sort of indeterminate, it's like the Greek allegory, you begin on one side of the river and you anticipate ending up on a certain part of the other side, but the water changes your course. History is very much of the same sort of uh, character. It's very kind of indeterminate and difficult to anticipate, but we can at least learn from what has happened and get a sense, for example, about what might cause a democratic transition or a state to fail, or a social revolution, or the formation of a certain type of electoral system, and so on and so forth. We can always learn about those causes and then have some sense of what might be causal again in the future when new circumstances arise that contain features or elements of the political world that we recognize from the past. Stephen says, two, comparison of different countries allows us to further understand the larger political world because it allows us to show how countries can politically put their differences aside and still be allies and work together on issues throughout the world. Yeah, absolutely. So there's of course a lot to learn about cooperation within countries and among countries, and how countries internally overcome collective action problems, for example, is really consequential. And that's one big question in comparative politics. How is it that societies form large coalitions or stimulate or promote cooperation between groups or consensus? For example, consensual democracy is one part of the debate about democracy that would relate closely to this focus on consensus and consensus building in divided societies. So we'll actually discuss that in this class as well later on. Karen says the comparison of countries allows us to understand the political world because it allows us to understand why certain countries' outcomes turned out a certain way and not another. Why are some countries the exception to that outcome? Exactly. Why are some countries deviant, or why did they depart from expectations when they're so similar to the other cases in all those other ways? And that's really good because you're noticing, Karen, that we want to isolate on that key difference or that key similarity that might then be important in a causal way in the actual real world, that world that we imagine to exist. Kevin says every single political government is an ongoing experiment. It is. This is true. In a broad sense, we can study what governments do as if it's a laboratory of some kind. And I know from my point of view, this is how I view the world, as a laboratory that we can impose discipline on and study in a systematic way. And so even though we might not have as much control, we can sort of create a pseudo control by comparing countries that isolate on those key patterns of similarity and difference. And so we're off to a fantastic start. And I want to continue this discussion by reading a quote that I think does a beautiful job emphasizing how much comparison plays a role in science. And this is a quote from James Jeans, who was a notable philosopher and scientist, who said, "All discussions of the ultimate nature of things must necessarily be barren unless we have some extraneous standards against which to compare them." And this quote draws on so many of the elements of our discussion just a moment ago. This idea that comparison involves establishing some external standard or some basis or some starting point that we can then use to evaluate new cases. The idea is that we can never truly evaluate something unless we establish some baseline first. And in comparative politics, and even in science generally, the comparison of different or similar things is the establishment of that baseline. And so comparison then is the establishment or using that baseline that we establish through multiple cases with different values on those key variables. So then comparison couldn't be any more scientific, and science couldn't rely any more on comparison than it does. It truly is a big part of the process. And it's so essential that we tend to take it for granted. In this discussion that we're having can become quite abstract because of how remote this might seem. But when we really think about it and drill down, we'll find that comparison is part of everything that we do in science. And so then what can we say about a science of comparative politics as we continue to connect these different elements? Well, what we can say is that in the same way that all science relies on comparison in the sense that it establishes an external standard, in comparative politics, we also use comparison in the establishment of those external standards to ask questions, to form hypotheses that might answer our questions, and then to test hypotheses and examine those hypotheses in actual data so that we can draw inferences about causes and effects. And so comparative politics can be done scientifically, as we've agreed and discussed, but more specifically, comparative politics is scientific in the way that we use comparison to establish that standard and then ask questions, form hypotheses, and test hypotheses. So we're going to continue to discuss this relationship between science and comparative politics. We're going to do it by saying a little bit more about how comparative politics shares similar goals, and then diving deep down into a discussion about different methods of comparison that we use, different methods of examining and testing data in a way that is systematic and draws on those similarities and differences and uses comparison to try to draw inferences. And we're going to do that by walking through some examples. And I'm very excited because eventually I'm going to have you take a look at some data and use the methods that I teach you to sort of evaluate and analyze that data. And we'll draw some inferences from that data. I'll give you a hint, we'll be analyzing civil wars. But before we get there, let's step back a little bit and continue to kind of unravel this link between science and comparative politics. Remember that we're mining the relationship between these two, and we're thinking about how and why comparative politics becomes scientific. And what I can tell you as we depart is that they share essentially the same goals. Comparative politics is also interested in description, describing the patterns that we see among cases. We're interested in classifying cases or making categorizations of cases based upon different standards or different measurements that we use to gauge different outcomes of interest. It also emphasizes hypothesis testing in the same way that the traditional scientific method emphasizes hypothesis testing. And then finally, although Kevin points out correctly that we're far less into prediction than explanation of the past, we do aspire to predict. We do aspire, we hope, to be able to anticipate what happens based on what we have studied and observed in the past and the inferences that we've drawn from the data that we've analyzed from the past. So what this means then is that both comparative politics and science require essentially the same steps: systematically collecting evidence, ordering evidence and searching for patterns, observing patterns, examining patterns among the data, among the cases, formulating and then testing contending explanations for the variation, the similarities or the differences among the cases, and then building more general theories based upon that data analysis and that set of inferences that we draw from those contending explanations that we analyze in the data. And so comparative politics is a science from the point of view of these objectives in the set of steps that we take in carrying out the research process within this area of political science. And what we're going to continue to look at as we unpeel this further is the different specific methods that we use in comparative politics. Now, I've got 3 methods for you, and we'll take them one by one. And what I intend to do with this is teach you the research process in comparative politics. This is an example. This is going to be a set of examples and a discussion that helps to show you the steps that you take in conducting research in comparative politics. Now, this is relevant for your paper. It's relevant for the exams as well. But it's also relevant because comparative methods are powerful tools for drawing causal inferences. And these are tools that you can use throughout this course, but throughout all your others as well, and in the future, and in a variety of different situations in life. It's a powerful tool for drawing inferences. And let's go step by step and take a look at the comparative methods that we use in this field of political science. Now, the first method is the simple task of asking questions. It might be the most important method of all, though, because we can't begin unless we identify a puzzle, a question, a problem. And in comparative politics, we use really two methods for asking questions. The first method is what we call a most similar systems design. And this is where we identify cases that have similar traits but different outcomes. So maybe you find two Latin American countries that have historical and geographical and political and economic similarities, but one of them transitions to democracy and the other one remains a dictatorship. That would be an interesting most similar systems design. Why did similar countries go different ways with their regime trajectories? Why did one become democratic while the other remained authoritarian? That's one example, and we'll look at more examples as we go along. The other approach is what we call a most different systems design. And this is the flip side of that first method. This is cases with different characteristics, but very similar outcomes. And so, for example, in Chile, the military seized control of the country and took over and threw out the democratically elected government in 1973. Now, despite having a very different cultural and historical and economic legacy, Turkey also saw its democratically elected government overthrown by the military on more than one occasion. These are very different countries with similar outcomes. Both had military coups and military rule for extended periods. These are different countries with similar outcomes. We might ask, why did these very different countries both experience military coups and military dictatorships? This is an example of how you might use that approach. But in both of these approaches, we're doing the same thing. We're identifying puzzles that lead to research questions. We're identifying patterns of similarity or difference that help us to ask questions about why those differences or those similarities exist. These are puzzles that emerge from the data and emerge from the world and that lead us to ask questions about the variation or the similarity. This is such an important task because this is where we begin. And without a good question, we can't really generate a useful theory, and so on and so forth. And so we begin by asking questions. So, what are some types of questions that we might ask in comparative politics? Why do some states fail while others do not? Why do some revolutions lead to transitions to democracy while other revolutions perpetuate authoritarian rule? We might ask, why do some political parties compete on policy programs while other parties compete on patronage? We might ask, why does the number of political parties vary from country to country? We might ask, why do some social movements achieve their goals while others do not? These are all examples of the kinds of questions that we ask in comparative politics. But what I want you to notice is that in each of these questions, we're identifying some variation or some pattern across cases. It's not why do some states fail, it's why do some states fail while other states do not fail. It's not why do some revolutions lead to transitions to democracy, it's why do some revolutions lead to transitions to democracy while other revolutions do not lead to transitions to democracy. It's not why do some parties compete on policy, it's why do some political parties compete on policy while other parties compete on patronage. It's not why is there this many parties in this country, it's why does the number of political parties vary from country to country. And at last, it's not why do some social movements achieve their goals, it's why do some social movements achieve their goals while others do not. And again, notice that in each of these questions, we're identifying some pattern across multiple cases. This is the absolute essence of asking a question in comparative politics. We're picking out that set of differences or similarities across cases, and we're asking questions that capture and ask about that similarity or that set of differences. And so let's take a look at a real example that we could do in a study of our own in comparative politics. And this is the example of democratization in South Korea. Now, South Korea transitioned to democracy in 1987. It was a momentous event. It ended years of military rule, and it started a process of liberalization that leads up to this day and the consolidation of a very strong democracy. So this moment in 1987 is important to us, and we want to know why this transition to democracy took place. But it's not enough for us just to look at South Korea. We actually can't learn anything about South Korea just by looking at South Korea. We have to look outside of South Korea. Looking at South Korea by itself might be enough to do a number of things. We can observe and describe and categorize perhaps, but we can't necessarily understand what caused that transition. We might be able to talk about who or what or why the transition occurred from what we can see, but we can't actually test that hypothesis or examine or systematically understand what might have been going on because we don't have variation in any of the variables that we might be interested in. But we can look beyond South Korea. We can take a look at North Korea. North Korea did not democratize. In fact, to this day, North Korea remains a totalitarian dictatorship, a brutal fascist regime that starves its people and spends more than half of its budget on the military. North Korea is a very different case, and the trajectory of North Korea is radically different over time than that of South Korea. But it wasn't always that way. There was a point where South Korea and North Korea went separate ways. And so it's useful for us to try to examine South Korea and North Korea simultaneously to try to figure out what caused that democratic transition in South Korea. So we're asking, why did South Korea transition to democracy while North Korea did not? What is it that happened in South Korea that did not happen in North Korea? How can we understand these two cases? And it's through this comparison and the difference that emerges across these similar cases that we become able to form hypotheses and then eventually test hypotheses and build general theories about democratic transitions. North Korea and South Korea, that is one example of a most similar systems design, similar cases with different outcomes. But there are many other countries that democratized at the same time, and these countries are very different from each other. And so while South Korea was democratizing, so too was Argentina, Turkey, the Philippines, Poland. These are countries in very different regions of the world, places with different histories and experiences and identities and politics, different systems, all sorts of variation of interest to us, potentially useful to us as we try to isolate on key patterns of similarity and difference. And so my point is that it's never enough for us to look at individual cases. We only begin to understand something when we examine patterns of similarity and difference across cases. South Korea and North Korea in democratic transitions being our example, but being only one example. My point to you is that we ask questions to understand these kinds of patterns. These are the patterns that become the basis for our research questions. And this set of puzzles that you might pick out when you look out at the world is going to become important for you in your own research in this class. And so this is how we begin, by asking questions and looking at patterns that might help to identify those patterns of similarity and difference for us that we need so badly to ask those questions. Let's look at another example. This is the example of the causes of civil wars. Now, civil wars are of interest to us in comparative politics. We want to understand what causes them. And though we don't study civil wars in this class, it's useful for us to use civil war as an outcome of interest because it's very important, and we obviously care a lot about that outcome and how to prevent it and maybe how to understand the consequences of civil wars better as well. And so let me give you an example of a set of similarities and differences that is really important when it comes to civil war in West Africa. This is a very interesting pattern, and we'll do more with this as we go along throughout the rest of this lecture and discussion. So we've got two poor and religiously divided West African countries, the Ivory Coast and Nigeria. Both of these countries had civil wars. But it becomes interesting because we've also got two other very poor and religiously divided West African countries in Benin and Ghana that remained peaceful. These countries did not experience civil war. And so we've got a set of similarities and differences here that is very curious, very, very interesting. West African countries, similar in terms of their levels of poverty and religious divisions, similar geography and history, and to some degree cultural affinities, but very different outcomes in terms of the civil war that happened in Ivory Coast and Nigeria, but not in Benin and Ghana. We ask ourselves, why is it that countries with similar characteristics, poverty and religious divisions, experience different outcomes in war and peace? This is another example of a research question. And this question is a little bit more sophisticated because notice that we've got 4 countries, not 2. Remember that South Korea and North Korea was our first example, and it's relatively primitive. We've got 2 cases. It's totally valid. It's a robust basis for a study, but 4 countries is obviously more interesting in some ways than 2 because we might be able to learn more from those 4 than we can from those 2. And so this is another thing that I want to tell you, which is that our comparative case study designs and our research questions can be based on 2 countries, or they can be based on 4 or 5 or 6. It just depends on how many cases you want to analyze and you think are relevant to the specific study that you're doing. Now, of course, in this class, I don't expect you to do any more than 2. And so don't be alarmed. I just want you to know that when we use these methods, they can be used with smaller sets of cases or more intermediate sets of cases, as many as 10 or 11 or 12 and up to 15 even. And so we can examine lots of cases together to try to figure out what might explain larger sets of patterns across larger sets of countries. So we've got this next question, this question of civil war. And the second method is now what we'll discuss, because after we ask questions, we've got to begin to form hypotheses. And the formation of hypotheses is an important step, obviously, because this is where we begin to consider the possible explanations of the outcome of interest that we've identified. And our hypothesis is that explanation. A hypothesis is an argument that links cause to effect. Hypotheses have 2 important characteristics. They are causal and they are testable and falsifiable. And what that means then is that we know when they're wrong and we know when they're right, and we can examine them to figure out if they're correct or incorrect, at least according to the data that we have. And so let's take a look at a couple different examples of hypotheses. Now you've seen this already. You saw this on Tuesday. And we took a look at hypotheses for economic development and democracy, hypotheses about how international diffusion affects democracy, and hypotheses that relate to electoral systems and the number of parties. And the reason that I gave you these examples and the reason I want to show you them today is because I want to remind you what they look like and the way they work. So we always have a very clear causal statement that implies a specific expectation. Developed countries will be democracies. Underdeveloped countries will not be democracies. So we look out at the world and we ask ourselves, is it the case that developed countries are democracies? Is it true that underdeveloped countries are not democracies? With diffusion in democracy, we have a simple declarative causal statement. Having countries that have democratized makes it more likely that you will democratize. Having no neighboring countries that democratize makes it less likely that you will democratize. Nice, straightforward. We can identify the causal statement and we can test those hypotheses to examine their validity and find out if they really are borne out in the evidence. And then finally, electoral systems and the number of parties. Majoritarian systems will produce 2-party systems. Proportional representation systems will produce multi-party systems. Straightforward, testable, falsifiable. These are examples of well-known hypotheses in comparative politics, but there are many, many, many others. There are innumerable others. And in this course, you'll be developing your own and also evaluating hypotheses in the article that you select for your theoretical and empirical critique. Now, when I say it's falsifiable, what I mean is that we should be able to look out at the world and ask ourselves, is it true that developed countries are democratic? Is it true that underdeveloped countries are not democratic? Let me give you another example, an example of a false hypothesis. A common hypothesis is that Islam is not compatible with democracy. But if that were true, Indonesia should not exist. Indonesia is a Muslim and democratic country. It is an example of a country where democracy appears to be compatible with Islam. Now, I simply give you this example to show you that that hypothesis is both falsifiable and false. Your hypothesis should also be falsifiable. It should also be false. Or, no, excuse me, it shouldn't necessarily be false, but it should be the case that you can figure out if it's false or if it's true, based upon looking at the actual world and looking at data. Now, this is where the magic begins to happen and where we begin to get down to the sort of most important level, perhaps, in our discussion about comparative methods after asking questions. After asking questions and forming hypotheses, we want to test our hypotheses. Do those hypotheses actually explain the outcomes in the data? Are those hypotheses correct according to the empirical information that we have? When we look at the world, is it consistent with our expectations? Is it consistent with what we expect based upon the hypotheses that we've developed? And we've got two methods for doing this. Now, these methods work alongside with the different designs, the research designs, the comparative designs that I already taught you as part of asking questions, that first step. And these methods are the method of difference and the method of agreement. Now, the method of difference compares and contrasts cases with similar attributes but different outcomes. And what you're doing is you're looking for clues as to why the cases differ. What is it that differentiates those cases? Why do similar cases go different ways? Is there something that differentiates them, that causes them to go different ways? What factor is it that differentiates them? Can you figure out what puzzle piece separates the two otherwise similar cases? Now, the method of difference works alongside the most similar systems design. It's compatible with that type of design, where you've got similar countries with different outcomes. Our second method is the method of agreement. And this is where we're comparing and contrasting cases with different attributes but similar outcomes. And we're looking for clues as to why the cases are similar. What is it that unites these otherwise radically different cases? They've got the same outcome, but they're otherwise very different. Is there something between them that they have in common that could explain that similar outcome? What is it that they have in common? What unites them? This is the method of agreement. And this method of agreement works with the most different systems design. Now, I'm telling you that because I want you to remember which methods work together and which methods complement each other so that you can use them and refer to them in your own work. Now, the method of difference involves comparing similar cases. These are sets of very similar cases where the outcome of interest varies. And for example, our example, Chile and Paraguay. Why did one country transition to democracy while the other remained an authoritarian regime in the 80s and 1990s? Now, the similarities between those cases are going to be social and political, economic, historical, and geographical. That's because they have so much in common due to their place, their geography, and their experience historically and with institutions. The similarities between these similar countries are often going to be linked to geography, but not necessarily. So remember that our example from West Africa, for instance, it certainly is linked to geography. There's an important role for geography. The same with our example with South Korea and North Korea. There's certainly a role for geography, but it need not be linked to geography, but it often will be for reasons that relate to the other sets of characteristics. You identify the variation to be explained between the two cases, and then the goal is to figure out, in what regard are these similar countries different? And then that is the key factor that we identify as explaining the variation in the outcome, right? So we're picking out very similar countries with different outcomes and then trying to find what it is that differentiates those countries that could have explained that variation in the outcome. We're looking for that puzzle piece that differentiates the two sides. Now, the method of agreement, on the other hand, involves comparing different cases. Now, this is the flip side of the method of difference. These are very different cases where the outcome does not vary. So our example of Chile and Turkey, for instance, these are both countries that experienced military coups and military rule, but they are otherwise very different cases. And we identify the outcome to be explained. In this case, it is military coup and military rule. And then the goal is to figure out what factor these different cases have in common. What is it that unites these otherwise very different cases? And then that uniting factor, that unifying factor, is the one that we identify as related to the outcome. And we begin to reason from that relationship that we identify. So let's do an example together. We're going to use both of these methods, and we're going to use them to evaluate and analyze some data that I've got that I use to create a sort of artificial data set for our purposes. Now, I call it artificial because I don't have labels for the countries, but I will tell you that the values and the variables relate closely to our example, civil war from West Africa, where we focus on different characteristics, but different or similar outcomes regarding civil war. So our example that we're going to work with is the causes of civil wars. Our outcome of interest is civil war. We want to figure out, why do some cases experience civil war while others do not? And we're going to focus on 4 key characteristics of a country. First, poverty. Second, rough terrain. Third, ethnic diversity. And fourth, religious diversity. These are all hypotheses. These are hypotheses on civil war. What are the causes of civil war? These different hypotheses submit different potential explanations of civil war. On the one hand, poverty might explain civil war. On the other hand, rough terrain might explain civil war. Ethnic diversity might explain civil war. Religious diversity might explain civil war. So these are our different hypotheses. And we're going to test these hypotheses in the data by taking a look at the patterns that emerge across the cases when we actually examine the empirical information. So we're going to start with the method of difference. And what I've done here is I've differentiated between positive and negative cases. Country 5 is a positive case of civil war because it has the yes under civil war. Countries 1 through 4 are negative cases. That means they did not experience civil war. And that's why they have no here in this column here. And so we're using the method of difference, and that means that we examine this data and we ask, in what way do these similar cases differ? What factor is it that differentiates these cases? And I'm going to put it to you. I want to ask you, and I'd like you to provide your input in the chat. And as you think about what factor differentiates these cases, I then want you to ask the next question, which is, what inferences can we draw from the data? That is to say, what does the data suggest causes civil war? And then also, what are the similarities or the differences across the cases, sort of descriptively? So I'm going to take a moment and pause, and I want you to examine this data, and I want you to provide your input in the chat, and then I'm going to incorporate your input, and we'll work out this together. We'll do this together, and I'll show you my own results from the analysis when I did it myself. So I'm gonna see if we can get lots of input before I read some of the comments, because I'd like as many folks as possible to kind of work through this kind of individually, because this is very likely your first experience with comparative methods. And so I will read all the input here in a few moments, but I'd like to see if we can get as much contribution as possible from all sorts of students. We're getting some excellent contributions, and I'm so happy to see that there's a lot of consistency between our observations, and that tells me that you all are looking at this data and seeing the same pattern and seeing that same sort of process, and that's really good. That means we're using the methods effectively. Good. Very good, Alejandra. That's an important part to add. Excellent. So Kevin, that's certainly relevant. You know, how does mountainous terrain affect these other things? That could be something that we sort out kind of theoretically as we develop the model further. But here, for our purposes, we kind of want to look at this primitively and kind of think in terms of these simple presence or absence variables. And so putting aside maybe how that rough terrain becomes consequential, let's just kind of look at what the data seems to suggest at kind of a surface level. Good. We're getting a lot of really good input, and what I'm seeing is that I think virtually all of us are on the same page here. Good. Good job. Okay. Good. Good, Karen. Good, Caesar. Good, Valentine. Good, David. Good, Kevin. Good, Alejandra. This is all excellent. We're all on the same page. Caesar, Alexis, Laura, Aylin, Stephen, Nina, Christiana, Ian. Yep, we're all on the same page. So I think that because we're clear on this, let's take a look at my results when I did the analysis and did some descriptive and causal inference after examining the cases to see how they differ. So what I observed is the following. In negative cases where civil war did not occur, countries 1 through 4, were all poor, flat, and religiously and ethnically divided. And positive cases where civil war did occur, which are in blue, differed from those negative cases in only a single way, and that was mountainous terrain. The positive case otherwise had all the same values on all the other variables. And so this is relatively straightforward. It suggests that mountainous terrain causes civil wars because this is the only variable that differs between the positive and the negative cases. And so this data, this evidence suggests that mountainous terrain causes civil war. Now, does it really? Well, we might want to test that hypothesis in a larger data set, but at least for these cases, that seems to be what it suggests. And so keep in mind that we're always going to be limited by the data that we analyze, but that data can always permit us to draw some inferences. And so in this case, the analysis suggests that mountainous terrain causes civil wars, and that, conversely, flat terrain can prevent civil wars, even in countries that are poor and ethnically and religiously divided. So that's an interesting result, and it's a way that we can begin to see how these methods work. Let's take a look at this represented in a different way, and I want to put this out there so that we can see for ourselves how the analysis produces this result. So mountainous territory differentiates the country that had a civil war, country 5, from the countries that did not have civil wars, countries 1 through 4. And if you look, we can differentiate them with color and by indicating which variable has the value that differentiates the cases. And that variable is the rough terrain variable. Notice again that all these are flat and this one is mountainous. And so this is the method of difference. We're examining similar cases to try to figure out how they are different and how that difference becomes consequential for the outcome of interest for us, which in this case is civil war. So this is the method of difference, but we're going to take a look at the data from a different angle. And this is new data. This is a different set of values on those cases. This is going to be an analysis using the method of agreement. Okay, so we're using a different approach now, and what we're doing is we're looking at different cases to figure out what they have in common. And again, what I have is I have the positive cases in blue. These are cases where civil war occurred. And then I have one negative case that's without a solid fill, and that is country 5. And what we're doing is we're asking ourselves, what factor do these different cases have in common? And what that means then is that you're going to be looking primarily at the blue, but you're also going to be looking at country 5 too to see if the pattern holds. And I want you to do the same thing that we did last time, where you try to figure out what factor unites these cases, and then draw some inferences, some descriptive and some causal inferences from the data. And this will help us to analyze this new data, and I'll show you in a moment my own results from my analysis when I did it myself. But I'd like to hear from you again, and I want to see what we can discern from this data. Once again, I'm going to kind of chill here for a moment, and I want to collect as many contributions as possible and then kind of reflect on them individually and kind of as a group. So go ahead and and let us know. And I'll be back with you in a moment. Just pause here and see what we come up with. Once again, I'm very pleased with these contributions. I'm happy to see that we're really thinking through this and really carrying out the steps in the process of the analysis, the descriptive and then the causal inferences. It's just excellent to see you working with these methods in this way. Good job, everybody. We're on the same page almost universally. Uh, I think virtually everyone has the same idea here, and that idea is that ethnic diversity might be connected to civil war in this data, at least. And the way we see that is the set of patterns that emerges among the cases. And let me go ahead and show you my analysis and my descriptive and causal inferences that I came up with. So first of all, I observed that positive cases where civil war did occur, which are in blue, they differed in poverty, rough terrain, and religious diversity, but all of them were ethnically divided. So what that means then is that really the only thing that they had in common is ethnic divisions. They differed along all of the other variables. And the negative cases where civil war did not occur, it says here in green, it shouldn't say that, that's an old from an old slide, were ethnically homogeneous. And so not only is it the case that countries 1 through 4 were divided, it's also the case that country 5 was homogeneous ethnically and didn't have a civil war. And so what this data suggests is that ethnic divisions cause civil war. And again, I want to stress to you that this is not a definitive statement of truth. This is what this data, this artificial data, suggests. We've got 5 made up countries here with different values on different variables. And at least according to this empirical information, ethnic divisions cause civil wars. And again, that comes from the fact that that's the variable that all of the cases of civil war had in common, while all the other variables they differed in. So again, we're looking at all this variation in these other variables. Ethnic diversity is the only one that they have in common. And so on this basis, we can draw the inference that ethnic divisions cause civil wars. And I'm going to take a look here at the chat and see what additional contributions we have here. Good. So we're all getting this, and I'm so happy. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Isis, Neela, Stephen, Caesar, Alejandra, Valentine, David, Kevin. Thank you, Alexia. Thank you, Anna Martha. Thank you, Alexis, Rady, Efren, Ian, Karen. Okay. Yes, thank you, everyone. We're all on the same page. We all see this pattern that I've outlined here in red, and this is an example of how we would use the method of agreement, where we're looking for that factor that unites the cases. And in your own research, I would encourage you to use these steps and to do the same thing. You form a question based on cases or puzzles that you identify. You form hypotheses. You get the data and the values that the different cases take on the different variables that come from your hypotheses, and then you draw inferences. You draw descriptive inferences, you draw causal inferences, and you try to figure out, what's happening in that data. How is this outcome of interest to me coming about? What is it that unites these different cases, or what is it that differentiates these similar cases? And it's those patterns of similarity and difference that become so important to us. And we see that in this data as well. And so we did a really good job with this exercise. I'm very pleased with your involvement, your contributions. Let me read in a clear, sort of straightforward statement the conclusion from this second component of the analysis. So using the method of agreement to analyze civil war, we concluded that ethnic divisions unite the 4 countries that had a civil war, countries 1 through 4. The country that did not have a civil war was different. It was ethnically homogeneous. And so that suggests then that ethnic divisions cause civil war. And so we see that represented here with pink and the italics for the ethnic divisions variable, which unites these 4 cases and differentiates them from country 5 here. So this is how we use the method of agreement and how we use the method of difference. And these are the methods that we use at a fundamental level in comparative politics. We ask questions, we form hypotheses, and we test hypotheses. And we use the comparative method to do all 3 of those things. And so what we arrive at is this point where we've gained the power of comparison, and we now are able to analyze data, test hypotheses, form questions, create research designs that would give us some leverage. And then the question becomes, what can we do with comparative methods that we cannot do without them? And you've seen for yourself, you've done it yourself. You've learned that what we can do with them is we can draw descriptive inferences, we can draw causal inferences, and in doing so, we can test hypotheses. We can test hypotheses because the patterns of similarity and differences across similar and different cases permit us to draw conclusions about causation and what sources of causation are bringing about the outcomes that we see in the data. We can do this because we can observe the variations between the variables across those cases. These methods permit us then to test hypotheses and draw inferences, and ultimately to build general theory. And in the final analysis, the creation of general theory is perhaps the most important objective of comparative politics, because the comparative method in the analysis of a few cases allows us to create theories with very clear categories and that are very elegant and very simple. Testing hypotheses permits us to build those theories because we get to show how different values and different variables will go different ways. And so in the end, whenever we build a theory in comparative politics, we begin by using comparative methods to test hypotheses, form and ask questions, and then ultimately to draw inferences. And so I want you to really commit this to memory and to use these methods in the class, and to be ready to use these methods in the assignments, and to be thinking from the perspective of comparative methods when we analyze problems. And what you'll see is that throughout the course, we'll use these methods in the lecture, in the assignments, on the exams, everywhere. And so this is what we're going to be using, and this is going to be our methodological perspective. And I'm so excited to continue, and I'm very excited to deal with the first substantive topic, which will relate to state formation. And we'll deal with that next week on Tuesday. But that does conclude our lecture and discussion for today. I'm very happy that you were with us today, and I think we accomplished a great deal. If you've got questions, you're free to stick around, and I'll chat with you over the chat or over the mic. Otherwise, you're free to go, and I hope you have a nice weekend, and I'll see you on Tuesday.
When are your office hours again?
Hi, Efren. My hours are, well, they're going to be 4 to 7 on Monday, Pacific time.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.